I'd rather look at it as asking the question, especially with digital today. This really comes strongly with digital. Um, is the customer now becoming part of our process?
Right.
Or are we becoming part of their process?
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
Welcome to another episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers. And in each of these episodes, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with various BPM practitioners, people that are working with organizations, whether internally or externally from a consulting perspective, but basically putting BPM into practice day in and day out. We're not talking about theory here. We're talking about, well, what does BPM look like in an organization? How does it deliver value? How does it, meet their strategic goals, their objectives and their direction? And in this episode, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Roger Burlton, who I'm very excited to have a conversation with. Now, Roger is the president of the Process Renewal Group, and he's also the co-founder of BP Trends Associates, which is the services firm for bptrends.com. And Roger's name has come up many times in many other interviews and various people I talk with, as having learnt a lot from him. So I'm feel really privileged to be able to sit down with you today, Roger, and interview you. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Daniel. I really appreciate it. I hope those people are saying nice things about me.
Absolutely. So what we might do to begin with is I'll pass it off to you to give our audience a bit more of a context and background as to who you are and the experience that you've had. And maybe start off with, when did business process management first pique your interest, and then take us on a journey leading up to today?
Well, I mean, I really started to get very interested in the process world. It actually about in the very late 80s, early 90s, because at that time, a lot of people were talking about things like quality management and solving customer problems and things like that. And so deep within quality was this idea of making sure everything worked together. And as an industrial engineer, I was always interested in that kind of approach to business anyway. And so it was right around then that I started to get interested in it. I was actually working for a telecommunications company. We were doing a lot of work internally to sort of get all the network management and customer service management sort of figured out. And it just seemed like a natural thing to me that we should be doing a better job of thinking things through, as opposed to just managing our little bits of work that we had in our desk every single day. So
Right.
pretty early in the game, actually. And it was shortly after that, 1994, that I left that organization and started up Process Renewal Group. And it's been onwards and upwards from then on. So.
Yeah. That's amazing. And I'd imagine that you would have, been into many organizations, seen many organizations, and I guess been a part of an organization adopting BPM and what that might look like. So I guess for organizations that do adopt BPM, what are some of the biggest challenges that they face?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is typically some people get it and other people don't. And so trying to have a conversation and having the words mean the same thing, and the understanding of even just the word business process. For so many people in an organization, they tend to think when a piece of work hits my group or my department, then the work starts. And once I've done and I've gotten rid of it, then the work is over. That's a process because I have to do work in order to get things done. But the perspective of trying to see things which go not just in your group, but in multiple groups, and how you connect those things up is all the way from the outside world with things coming in and moving back to the outside world with things going out, like from a request to a service, from all the way out to an invoice and a payment, all those things which happen at the interface with the outside world. That's what really starts your process. And so there are lots of people who see things from the point of view of their group, their department, their function, their specific responsibility, who don't really see it well across the organization, because our org charts don't support that perspective very well. So I really do think it's a matter of just understanding. And we still find today, so much of what we do is socialization, education, getting a common understanding. The customers really couldn't care less about your department or your function or your group or your software or your anything. Right. They just care about something happens that interests them. And until they're satisfied, the work's not done. That's how we would define a process. But it's really, really hard to get traditional functional managers to think that way, and to get them to agree to look across organizational boundaries is still, I think, the biggest challenge we face.
Yes. Right. And so obviously when talking to these managers, maybe senior leadership, maybe the executive, that executive level, how do you communicate the value to them of BPM? How do you, I guess, speak their language, use terminology and words that they understand and that they want to hear?
Yeah, I think we always try to look for somebody who really does care about doing the right things for customers and external stakeholders. And now, if you go high enough, you're going to find that in the chief executive officer. And if you talk to people on the front lines, they really, really understand that they want to do a great job for their customers. But you have these layers in the middle, which they're filtering things up and down out of the discussion. And so we always try to find someone in the organization who really understands it, to be a champion. Somebody who hopefully has a seat at the executive council, who can sort of have the discussion that says, if we do all these things that we're looking at, all the things that you executives are asking us to do, it's still not going to make any difference to the customer satisfaction and our profitability and our ability to do higher quality and get new customers and keep customers. So moving the conversation to an outside-in conversation rather than an inside-out conversation. We always look for someone who can sort of champion that discussion and that cause, because without being able to have that conversation, what you're really doing is you're just fighting against powerful people who are measured on something other than the net outcome of value to external stakeholders. So just trying to get people to see the value of being great suppliers to customers, great partners to other organizations. There's always people in there who understand that, but there's also many people are hidden away from that point of view. So finding your champion. If you can't find the champion, what we typically try to do is have some small wins, even do something less than end to end. Measure before and afters and show we've made a performance difference. So I think the ultimate in all this is become performance based as opposed to even process based. Right. People sometimes think the process is a constraint and they don't want to hear it, but they certainly can understand profitability. They can understand time to market. They can understand customer retention. They can understand upselling your customer, like all the things which they can understand. We can measure that, and we can say, we're going to make a difference in that performance indicator. Right. Now I can talk to the executive.
That's great. That's a great point. And it reminds me of something Michael Roseman actually mentioned or touched on in our conversation, talking about how far greater is the outcome than the output. You know, you don't want to just be doing work for work's sake. You want to be actually looking at, well, how is this delivering value, and is this delivering value?
Yeah, we have a great analogy for that. And Roger Tregear also uses a similar analogy, and it's got to do with when you go to the airport to go on a trip, which I can only imagine these days. But if I go to the airport, I basically give the airline my luggage. And when I get to the end of the trip, I get my luggage back. Well, that's an input and an output. What's the outcome of getting my luggage back? Now I can go on holiday. Now I can go to that business meeting tomorrow in something other than my jeans and the t-shirt I wore on the plane the night before. And I can actually get value because I got my luggage back. And then you often hear Roger Tregear talking about the issue that, well, maybe we fix this by becoming the best airline in the world with the customer experience of lost luggage. Right. Well, that's not value. The value is don't let it happen in the first place.
Yes.
And allow me to get on with the purpose of what I wanted to do originally. Can I accomplish that? Now I have value.
Yes, that's good. And you mentioned earlier or just before about small wins, getting those wins. And I think that's something that's important for that the executive team or senior leadership, they'll want to understand and to get that buy-in from them is, well, what is the return on investment and how long is it going to take before I start realizing that value? Do you have, and I'm sure you do, but are there a few examples that come to mind where, an organization has implemented or adopted BPM and it has delivered significant value?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, it could be small value or large value. I think that if you don't have the credibility inside the organization with the executives, and quite often you don't, because as a BPM person, you may not be senior enough, and you may need that senior to senior discussion. So you're going to have to do something which appeals to them. So finding that small pain point. And I remember we had a situation like very, very early in my career where there was an organization which hadn't paid much attention to its external customers. Because really what they did, they manufactured product and they basically sold it to a distributor, and the distributor then sold it to the marketplace. So they were quite far from the consumer, very close to their customer, but quite far from the consumer, the customer's customer. And we basically put in place something really, really simple. It's just a much better process for the consumers to go directly to the company rather than coming through that channel. And as a result of all that, what they found was this very high degree of engagement with regard to simple things. And this was an organization that manufactured food items and chocolate, for example. And so just even having something where we're putting in place something where people could call up and say, for example, I'm going to give it away now, but to say something such as, do you have a recipe so I can make M&M's cookies?
Right.
Because before they would have sold M&M's to a big retailer and never have any idea. But then what they did as a result of this, they actually realized that if they actually reached out to the consumer, they could pull product through the customer to the consumer rather than focusing on the customer. That's little help desk or call center they put in place, that they measured everything with regard to customers, the consumer sentiment changed everybody's thinking about how they should even look at the organization. So it was a small win that got people thinking in a different way. It was quite rewarding.
Yes.
And that's a pretty small one. But there's also plenty of big ones where organizations that are able to reduce the delivery time of products to market and do a much better job of forecasting what the demand would be, so that their inventory was at a much more appropriate level. So they were never out of stock, but they still managed their inventory well. And so that whole supply chain management is something we work with quite a bit, and people are still wrestling with that because it's hard to match. Demand with supply. Right. And so matching those two, just getting those two, like planned demand, planned supply, putting them together and having them work together, really, really cut down on the number of orders that were not delivered on time or in full.
Right.
And when you don't deliver on time and with full with big customers, then they actually penalize you, and it costs you money. And in addition to that, your product's not getting to market. Those are the conversations that we were able to have when we focused on what started out to be a small problem.
Yes, right. And you're obviously talking a lot about, the customer journey and the customer experience, and, because ultimately that's what the organization is doing. You're delivering value to the end customer. How do you balance, as a BPM practitioner, how do you balance, I guess, working on that customer journey versus, I guess, the internal processes and what the internal employees are delivering, how they're, the steps they're taking?
Yeah, I quite honestly, I don't distinguish between the two.
Right.
I understand the two perspectives, but what I'd rather look at it as asking the question, especially with digital today. This really comes strongly with digital. is the customer now becoming part of our process?
Right.
Or are we becoming part of their process?
Right.
So
Okay.
if we think, and then you think of, again, especially with digital, you can see that there's information which is exchanged. Our information goes to them, their information comes to us. It's one journey, one set of common data, one set of shared business rules, which can either be put in their hands or our hands, but it's one flow all the way through. So if you do your customer journey map, you should, right next to that, put the internal process map. And if you do the customer journey map, then we'll define our own internal processes according to the value created along the way for the customer. And there's not a difference.
Right.
There probably is with legacy systems, we probably are supporting a difference. But when we renew the process, we should be looking at, can we make sure we manage that information as one set of integral information that both sides need to get benefit from. If both sides aren't winning, then no one's winning.
Yes. Yeah. And when we were talking about the wins before, you mentioned, that there are small wins and there are big wins. There are micro improvements and there are large improvements. How does an organization approach that? How does an organization, or when should an organization focus on, I guess, the micro tweaks of a process? And when does it get to the point where they need to radically innovate the way they're doing things?
I think you need to have both, right? And so you need to be able to do the small changes all the time, because we're always learning, we're always getting better, and so on. But those small improvements are not going to make massive changes by themselves usually. So usually we're looking at BPM from 2 points of view, from a process and process improvement perspective, but also from a strategy and business architecture perspective. So if we start to define all the processes of the organization at a high level, in an architecture, 1, 2 levels, maybe 3 levels deep. And then we start to map those processes back to our strategic intention. Now, we where I live in Canada, we call it the North Star. So I apologize for those of you south of the equator. You'll have to go with the Southern Cross. But the point is, some place of constancy to evaluate your processes. And that should come out of your strategy work, and you should come out of your stakeholder analysis work. And so what's important to customers, where are we trying to take the organization? You just got a handful of criteria that we can use to say, if I map these things which we say are important to our business, where we're trying to take it, I map that to each one of those processes I've mapped out. I'm going to find some of them are more relevant than others.
Yes.
Some processes will be more relevant than others. Like washing the windows is not going to be nearly as important as bringing a new product to market.
Right.
So, but then we can sort of do that mapping, and we actually call that mapping the pain gain analysis. So the gain part is strategic relevance. The pain part is current performance relative to where you need it to be. You put those two things together, and then out of that should come a set of big process priorities, which should go into more of a transformation program, because that's probably going to mean I'm changing the process, I'm changing policies and rules, I'm changing skills and competencies, I might be changing organizational structure, I'm certainly going to end up touching technology. And so the transformation program will come out of those big processes. That's strategy. On the other end, once I've gone through that and implemented something, then I can ask the question, how do I learn from this? Because I'm not going to get it perfect first time. How do I learn from it? How do I stabilize it? How do I then sort of be able to continue to improve as we learn, as we're going, and see the continuous improvement as a way of life,
right?
Not just something we do when something goes wrong. Continually evaluate, can we do better? Can we do better? Can we do better? Until we get to the point where little tweaks aren't going to do it anymore, and you got to go right back to the strategy. So I see these two things happening sort of at the same time. And it's what Roger Tregear talks about with two virtuous circles. And so we have the circle of the big picture versus the continuous improvement, and they feed off of each other all the way through.
Yes, right. I like what you're saying there about pain and gain, because I think that is two focuses that needs to be held in tension. And I was reading an article the other day, and the article dates back to 1994, I think it was, and it talks about this idea of preservation versus creation in regards to from an organizational perspective, and there, I guess the author's point of view was that too many organizations were spending their time and their focus and their attention on preservation, and there weren't too many that were creating the future. And he basically summed it up at the end that if you're not creating the future, you're going to be playing catch up to another organization that is pioneering the future.
Well, unless you're Microsoft, you don't get away with that.
True.
Because Microsoft has a very clear strategy that it won't invent those things, but as soon as it sees it, it's going to jump in and go with it and take the market.
Right.
But that's okay when you've got that much money and that much power in market. Most organizations will basically, they'll have great ideas, but they stick with it too long, they're going to be in trouble. One of the things that I really notice now, and it's been true for 50 years maybe, is that time in market continues to shrink.
Right.
So you don't have 20 years to take advantage of your great ideas when you create something. Now you got to create it quickly, and you've got to sustain it while in market. And that, which also means you have to create it in such a way that you deliberately design it to be able to change it. As a matter of fact, designing for change is more important than getting the specifications perfect.
Yes, right.
Because then you can go in market, you can evolve, you can learn, you can go from there. And so we see there's great design techniques now which do that. It comes out of the process architecture, and it's just simple things like never embed your business rules in your business process.
Yes.
Why?
Right.
Because they're going to change dramatically quickly. And if I can externalize my business rules, I can change the rule without messing with my process. The process executes and just looks up today's rule.
Yes, right.
Then now I'll stay in market longer because I can sustain what I put in place. So and quite often we get in trouble because organizations, I think, do transformation. It takes them 5 years. They get to the end of it. They say, great, we're done. Haha, no, you're not. We're going to start the next one tomorrow. But if you start thinking about designing for agility, designing for change, designing for adaptability, assembling solutions together, but using the business process as sort of the hub or the backbone upon which you can connect those things together. I think processes are really, really important to make sure that takes place.
Yes. No, that's great. And just on that, talking about being agile, having that sort of agility method or practice, it's something that I have heard that sometimes people will say, oh, we're doing an agile thing, not process. Process is governance. Process slows things down. We need to be quick to adapt and change and things like that. But then there are plenty of people out there as well who see how both of them complement one another and how they do work hand in hand. I guess what's your perspective on that, and do they complement one another?
Well, we have an expression we like very, very much, and we call it freedom within a framework.
Right.
And so what we find is the architectural level, if we really understand your business information, your business processes, and your business capabilities, things you have to build, really understand those and how they fit together, then I can go inside and be incredibly agile because I'll know the boundaries. I'll know the intentions. I'll know what I'm trying to do. But and you can have agile architecture. That sounds crazy, but you can have agile architecture where you say, we're going to build a bit, we're going to build on it, build on it, build on it. Or we're going to go kilometer wide, centimeter deep, and then we'll go deeper where we need to based upon, say, the pain gain. But you build it out over a period of time. So we really need to think of those, as I mentioned before, the design principles that say it's going to change. But if I iterate down in the implementation level, I'm never going to iterate my way to a new market. to a new set of customers, to a new business model, and to a new way of sort of structuring how the organization works. That's never going to happen there. You have to deliberately think about that, and you can't just go in and start. Look at all the organizations today where they're really, really stuck with their old technology stack, and they'd love to do things different from a business point of view, but they can't do it because they're constrained by what they've got in place already. And then when they go to replace the stack, then they go and buy this big ERP and they pour the concrete again, as opposed to designing it so it is modularized and table driven and rules independent and reusable capabilities and things like that. They don't think about architecting for agility. I think that's very different than agile software development, which is when I got a particular thing to build out, then I can build that in a very agile style, but I need that. That's the freedom part. But the framework is the superstructure where you know exactly where that's going to fit. And maybe if I'm building something in an agile fashion, I should be looking at it and saying, you know what, this piece I'm building here could also work there, and there. So as an example, if we see a lot of people working these days on identity management, the idea that who are you? If you apply for a credit card, you apply for a mortgage, you apply for a loan, you want to sign up for other financial services in a bank, I should have one way of doing identity management.
Right.
As opposed to, I'm going to build it for this specific problem, for this specific group. And I do that in a very agile development style. That doesn't solve the problem of now I'm going to do it 4 times, 4 different ways, because as each group asks for it, you need the architecture that says identity management plays in these 4 processes.
Right.
And what do I need to do for all of them to share it and have one consistent way of doing it? And then if I need to change identity management, I can change it. They all benefit.
Yes. Right.
But you need your big process picture to be able to do that.
Yes. And I think that, what we've seen over the last 5, 10, 15 years has been a lot of startup businesses that have gone into markets, into existing markets, but completely disrupted them because they come into it from an outside perspective, I guess, with a new way of thinking. And how can we deliver this value in a completely different way that's never been done before? And I guess that, we've seen that happen in a number of different quite industries, famous cases. And, it does force big organizations to start thinking, well, if we're not disrupting ourselves, someone else is going to come along and disrupt us.
Very good point. But, but the thing is, we've been having this conversation one way or another for a long time. I think that probably the most famous book on this is Clayton Christensen's a book about the innovator's dilemma.
Right.
And there's so many great studies in there that basically show these startup companies, they get in, they get going, they get successful, and then they start to adopt the behaviors of the big companies that they disrupted. Right. And then they get disrupted. and it is because, like, I remember, even though, for example, Apple has been so successful with iPhones and things like that, you look at some of the early things they did, they weren't so great at this. Sure. Like they had a product called the Newton. And if you remember, it was basically a handheld device that did all the things or at least they were attempting to do all the things that, let's say, an iPhone could do. But it was like 1% of revenue of Apple. And it was costing money, and the uptake in the market wasn't very great. So Apple killed the Newton. Well, they could have been where they are today even much sooner if they'd stayed on that path. And that was because when they were an upstart and they were disrupting everybody else with the Macintosh and things like that, that was great success. But that 1% of revenue was more than they had ever made on the Macintosh early, which they supported and went with, because relatively speaking, they adopted these very very rigid management decision-making structures. Right. So one of the things that I saw early on in all that was that most of these great disruptive ideas actually came from people who worked in those big companies didn't see the light of day and left and started something on their own and were successful. So it's not like the ideas aren't there. It's I believe it's that the investment management wasn't there, but the ones who were successful basically took that piece and put it off to the side and said, we're not going to measure you the same way we measure our existing products. A little bit of a development lab type of approach, the type of thing that a 3M would do.
Right.
Give people money to play with things and try it out, and otherwise we wouldn't have had Post-it notes, right? So.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think there is such an opportunity there to empower people within organizations. The process practitioners, the frontline employees, they're the ones that are picking up the phone, making the calls or answering the calls. They're the ones that are on the workshop floor or within the factory or the warehouse carrying out the process. And so they probably have the best perspective on what's actually going on and where are opportunities for improvement. How could we do this better? I'm experiencing these pains, as opposed to someone external watching on and being like, well, I think it could be better done this way. And you know what, this is how it's going to be done. And then, this person that's been doing the same thing for 5, 10, 15 years doesn't feel empowered to look for solutions.
Right on. But see, I think it brings up another key aspect in all this, and that's culture.
Right.
What type of culture do you want to support? And I think you have to seriously look at that. But I believe very strongly, and my business partner, Sasha Aganova, definitely believes this very, very strongly, that if you don't know the structure of what you want to do, you cannot just change behavior generically. You have to be able to say, this behavior is not what I want. This is the behavior I want to have, and work towards the transformation of behavior to support the process to be done in the way you wish. It doesn't happen by accident.
Right.
It's hard work.
Yes. And I think that, that has to be an intentional thing, as you're saying, regarding behavior. I think there are a lot of BPM practitioners out there that are quite technical and about the diagrams and the flow charts and the standards and notations and things like that. But at the end of the day, you're working with people. People are your best resource. You can leverage people and get so much value when in a team, where if you include people, if you empower people to come along for that journey, than if you try to do it yourself.
Yeah, I think you're right.
But there's one other point that you mentioned before about critical processes and finding the most valuable processes. And for someone listening to this conversation that maybe they're in an organization where they're at the very beginning of their BPM journey, or maybe they haven't even started yet, how do you identify those critical processes and where they need to be spending their time, effort, and energy first?
Yeah, I have to apologize for the common sense, because I actually believe most of this is common sense.
Yes,
it's common sense to say, how do I make my business better, as opposed to how do I argue with this other executive on the next office to me. So I think that you really have to come back to what we talked about before. And that is, who are your stakeholders? What's important to them? So what is success for them? And then when you look at that from a regulatory, a customer, an owner, a supplier, partner, even from an employee point of view, you say, well, what are all the things that they believe it make this successful? Boil that down to that North Star, because all the North Star is a set of criteria that you will use to choose among competing alternatives and competing designs. So even when you get inside the process, you might have multiple options. Which one are you going to go with? You go with the one that best fits your strategic intention. Right. So we worked with a company a few years ago, and what we boiled out of all of this was that they wanted to significantly grow the business, outgrow the market year on year for 5 years, and basically double the business in a incrementally small moving marketplace. And And so they decided they wanted to do that. They wanted to generate cash. They wanted to make customers happy. They wanted to reach the consumers. They wanted to keep their staff longer, retain them, and so on. Put all this together. And then out of all that, we said, well, in order to do this, what's critical? Well, one of the things they said that was critical then is that, and sometimes you can call this strategic capability or strategic requirements or critical success factors. You can use any of those terms for it. But that's associated, first of all, get the intention, figure out what's critical, and then say which of the processes that can deliver against that. And in that particular case, we came up with 2 processes that were critical. There's no way they were going to naturally grow their business unless they brought new products to market quickly and they acquired competitors.
Right.
Because otherwise it was not going to be possible to do what had to be done. But first of all, you have to agree on what the criteria are for success. What does success look like? So go out and get that nailed. And if you're new to this, basically saying, well, I think I'm hearing these things. This is what I think success looks like. And then go to people and say, as we do our BPM work, we're going to use these criteria to recommend and make decisions. Is that okay?
Right.
And then you do that with each of the executives, rather than later on coming up with ideas and going to the executive and say, well, which one of these do you like? What about you? Which one do you like? Which one's better for you? No, let's get the criteria for decision making agreed before we make any designs, before we make any decisions. So you have to basically put that in there. And what every single workshop we ever have with anyone, we're going to put that picture in the front of the room and saying, this is how we're going to decide in this room. Remember, we all agreed on this before. Is this still good?
Yes, right.
And so that way, it's not a matter of you, the BPM person, saying what the solution should be. You're always reflecting, something like a mirror. You're almost reflecting back on the people in the business, and you say, I'm just here to help you deliver what you need.
Yes.
But if you don't have the criteria, it becomes a personality discussion. It becomes a battle of wills. And sometimes the powerful executives win. And that may not be best for the business.
Yes, right. Another thing you said earlier was, when introducing BPM to the executives, some just get it and some just don't. But for someone that's, trying to, I guess, pitch BPM internally within their organization, what are some of the, I guess, the common objections that they might face? And then how do you handle those objections?
Well, it's the classic John Zachman view of the world. He always says, oh, well, everybody says it's going to take too long, going to cost too much.
Right.
So, but then the question is, well, what's it going to cost if you don't do it?
Right.
How long will the next initiative take you if you don't figure this out now? Mm-hmm. So it'll always be a build from scratch rather than a leverage of a lot of the good things you have. If I can change 10% of what I got and make a big difference, I'd rather do that than start from scratch every single time. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's one thing I hear from the executives, and they're just afraid of it. Well, the other objection is, the real objection is, I don't understand it, but I'm not going to tell you that. Right. Because it sounds like it's a risk. They've been trained on doing strategic planning and especially portfolio management and investment choices in a bottom-up way, where everybody once a year comes and says, this is what I want, this is what I want, these are all the projects, let's pick something, as opposed to doing it from the process architecture moving on out. And so that's an issue. The other thing that we see is the exact opposite, and that is this deathly fear of, you're going to take away all my decision-making authority. You're going to proceduralize everything we do. I've got to follow every step of this process exactly the way it is. And I won't be able to respond to the reality of my customers as I'm dealing with them. Right. And we see a lot of that. I mean, just go to your mobile provider, go to your airlines. You see you get fed back all these rules that they can't do anything about. So there's this fear that we'll just sort of dumb it down too much. Right. The frontline work, especially the middle managers and the frontline workers, there's a big fear about that. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we always say is that sometimes the best solution is to take away the overbearing rules and give you more decision-making authority. So they hear process, but they really hear procedure.
Right.
So I think that's sort of the opposite one that we see. And maybe the biggest thing overall is they think it's risky because they
Yes.
don't understand it.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think that, that fear is not just in that senior leadership either. It's, it is the frontline workers as well, that this fear of like, well, why do you want to know what I'm doing? And what are you going to do with those processes? And will I have a job after this? Are you going to give this to a robot or automate it or something like that? So
Right. It's just a human concern. It's a concern about the unknown. We don't know what it's going to be. And maybe you haven't earned the trust yet.
Right.
And if you've always been honest with them in the past and listen to them and try to do, because I find most of the time, if you do things which are right for the customer, they're probably right for the employee as well.
Right.
A lot of times they're so frustrated they can't do the right thing. This is poor people who work in these help desks, call centers. They get these angry customers calling all the time. They don't want to do that. They want to help them. And so if we can do the right thing for the customer, whether it's an internal or external customer, then we'll like our job so much better as well, and it will show.
Right.
So,
yeah. No, that's great. And now looking towards the future of, BPM in organizations, BPM delivering value for organizations. And I understand that, every organization is at a different maturity level, whether they've started on their BPM journey or not. And so they'll require different things at different times. But obviously technology is a huge thing where we're hearing things about robotic process automation and process mining and things like that. But I guess from your perspective, what do you think organizations, or where do you think organizations need to be putting their time, effort, and energy into over the next 2, 3, 5 years?
Well, I'll hit those two that you mentioned right off the top and go to the other ones. I think that what people have to realize, and this is what will scare a lot of frontline workers, if you can go to robotic process automation, you're going for the most simple, straightforward, most proceduralized, most rule-driven stuff, which is not very interesting or exciting. It's just basically a play to have a worker, which is an automated worker, work. You probably get something. I think the number is something like you get 7 times the productivity out of a robot than you do an individual doing the same thing. I take a piece of information from here, I apply a couple of rules to it, and I put it over there, and it goes into some other system, and I make a few mistakes along the way, and so on. But if I can put a robot doing that, then I think that is okay. But the robot generally is not an artificial intelligence advisory piece of software, even though you're getting some smarts coming into it. But they're not really being asked to do that.
Right.
And I must admit, I might be a bit of a heretic here, that I think it's the same, a little bit the same with process mining, because you're mining what you're currently doing, and that might give you some good arguments to show where you can make some improvements. But I can't. It's a bit like lean. I can't lean my way to a whole new thought process for a whole new line of products.
Right.
I'm not going to find that with mining either. So I think that those things play much more at the tactical level than they do at the strategic level. Right. So, and I think they're good tactical tools. Don't get me wrong, nothing wrong with them. But you have to step back and ask your question. If I'm doing the pain gain, and I have something which is high pain and high gain, strategically important, I have to really rethink how I'm going to do it. Process mining probably won't help me much. But if I'm doing continuous improvement, it might.
Right. Okay.
So I think using the right tool for the right thing will be quite important. I think that we can't ignore the whole issue around innovative thinking and new ideas and experimentation and trying something and seeing if it works, seeing what the uptake is, learning from doing it. Sort of like, it's a bit like business analysts talk about it, minimal viable product. Can you get something out there, learn from it, adapt it, adjust it, build on it? That whole learning, whole ideation cycle, I think that's just as important. And artificial intelligence could be a big player in a lot of the stuff. We've seen examples recently where an organization I'm working with right now it is a regulatory body that examines safety, technical safety of things like electrical systems, gas systems, boilers, elevators, all these quite complex technical things. And when COVID came along, they had to sort of rethink things a little bit, accelerate something. And so they would always figure out where would they go in order to find potential hazards, because their job is to avoid them in the first place. So the people who worked in all the regions around would say, okay, this is the list. I'm going here, I'm going here, I'm going to go here and look for these things. They put an artificial intelligence system in place to basically learn from where hazards come and where risk is with regard to the various types of systems and so on. Within a month after implementing that, they were finding 4 times the number of hazards they ever found when done manually. So what they now do is they build around that. But so they change the process because that technology could do something fundamentally differently, much better than a human could do it.
Right.
So that's sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, where I can really rethink my business because I've got that technology available. That's very different. That's very different than robotics. Robotics requires you just automate something which is sort of sitting there with a defined flow already. Yes, you need both ends. It's like all of these things. It's not one or the other, I don't think. I think you have to find the right balance between the two things.
Yes.
And the BPM people have to sort of be able to cover both sides of it, I think.
That's great. That's good. And I think as we go into the future and new technologies are, brought to the table, so to speak, I have noticed that some organizations will dive into certain technologies because they see their competitors using it. And they may have a different culture. They might not even have their executive sponsorship. They may not have a number of sort of foundational elements in place before embarking on this, journey that they're expecting the same results, but they're starting from a different base. How important is it getting those foundational elements right? And what are those crucial, I guess, foundations that organizations are forgetting?
I think you're right. I mean, one of the challenges I see, with all due respect to organizations like Queensland University of Technology, which has a different view of this. I respect them tremendously because they really do think about different business models, not just technology. Right. So I congratulate them, special Michael Roseman, on some of the messaging that's been put out with that. But most business schools don't teach cross-functional management.
Right.
They teach finance, marketing, accounting. Maybe the best you get is sort of supply chain management, which is the closest thing you get to anything cross-functional. So no one's learning this. So the people we have in management are, for the most part, not learning to think cross-functionally or to analyze or design cross-functionally. Right. I think the number one thing we got to do is we've got to start seeing those cross-functional end-to-end business processes as foundations, not as things we layer on top of an org chart. If you think about it, if you have a process end-to-end for a customer, they couldn't care less about the org chart. Matter of fact, if they understand the org chart because they've had to navigate it, then there's something wrong.
Yeah, that's right.
So I should be able to reorganize 10 times and not change the process. Because the organization is just a means to an end. We got to come, I think, much more focused on managing horizontally rather than vertically. And I think that organizations that don't do that, it's just a matter of time.
Yes,
I do think this is inevitable. And if you sort of go back and look at the Industrial Revolution, and I actually did this. I actually made a trip to the UK. I went to all the Industrial Revolution sites, which drove my kids crazy at the time. It's not much of a holiday, Dad. And looking at those, I learned that the Industrial Revolution took like 175 years to take hold.
Right.
And so we're actually undoing the Industrial Revolution, and we're not going to do it in 30 years.
Right, right.
So a little bit of patience is probably necessary, but I think there will be casualties in all of this.
Yes, yes. And I guess for the people that are working as business analysts or BPM practitioners, what should they be thinking about now to prepare them for the future? Because, as we've talked about, talking about the future and the new different technologies and things like that, how should they be upskilling, and what sort of things should they be learning about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's still what's now sort of the traditional stuff about analysis, design, modeling. I think those are all good skills. But I also think they have to learn a lot of the human skills, because there's still a lot of influencing that has to take place, a lot of communication that has to take place. It's not just about the models. It's about being able to discuss the value proposition, and being able to be empathetic to the people in the business. So you can't just say my model's done, it passes quality check. I've got all the circles in the right place and all the arrows go the right way and all my lanes work out perfectly well. It's more than that. The question is, that's just a model. But what's behind that model?
Right.
What's really happening in the business, and be able to have that communication. I think learning the soft skills is going to be really, really important. You can learn the other ones. So learning how to communicate, learning how to understand a customer, which is your internal customer, I think those skills are going to be really quite important. And I do think the ability to step back and look at the bigger picture, as opposed to a lot of business analysts, especially, are taught to dive deep and do specifications. Right. I think it's more important to be able to step back and see how does all this work together, as a set of skills that are required. I think learning business architecture is important. I think learning and business architecture is process, but it's also more than process. It's also information, and it's also stakeholder analysis, and it's also strategy, and it's also there's been this raging war about process versus capability for years. You need to learn about capability as well.
Right.
But and so I see becoming a bit more wider in the skills, and learning how the pieces fit is, I think, if you can do that, you're going to be very much in demand for a long time to come. This is not a dying profession. I mean, people told me this in 1994 when I started this company up. They told me, "Oh yeah, this would be good for a little while." Well, it's still there.
Yeah.
So it will be for a while, I think.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And so I guess on the back of that, for the people that are listening right now and they do want to learn more, maybe this conversation has been their introduction to the world of BPM. Where should that person go now to learn more about BPM?
Well, I would give you sort of, in addition to some of the, which is now becoming virtual training everywhere. There's virtual training happening out of Australia. We're doing stuff through Australia, through Europe, through everywhere else. It's all been happening all around the world now. But I would say that from our own point of view, you can go to the processrenewal.com website. There's a series of 12 articles that teach you about this cross-functional management. Each is about 12, 15 pages, so they've got some depth to it. Those are free downloads. Just go there and download those types of articles. But also go to BP Trends, bptrends.com. There's always been sort of the premier source for knowledge about this. And a number of people write from different points of view. And also they get a really, really good search capability to go back and look for things from 10, 15, 20 years ago. You mentioned an article in 1994. A lot of the stuff written then, it was still good.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. So yeah, I would look for those types of places too. And I mean, and if you are in Australia, I mean, you can always get your master's program out of QUT, which is the only one I know. It's only two in the world I know of, which is a business process master's program as well.
Right.
So there are a few places. Look for those places if you're so inclined. Right. But a lot of universities now also have extension, the university extension from the business school. So if you graduate from university, take another class or two, take another certificate on top of what you're doing right now. We are seeing more of that happening.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. Well, Roger, obviously we can only cram so much into a 50-minute conversation, and we've only really scraped the surface on what there is to know and learn. And but I think, one of the most valuable parts about this is, the audience is learning from someone who hasn't just learnt about it in theory, but you've been putting it into practice. You've been working with organizations. You've been facing and overcoming various challenges and hurdles and roadblocks and things like that. And so I think that is a great source of knowledge for the rest of us to be able to learn from. So I guess on behalf of the Process Pioneers community, I just want to thank you for sitting down with me today and sharing all of your stories and experiences.
Well, thank you, Daniel. I appreciate the offer to speak. We're always happy to share whatever we can, because we're all still learning together.